There are people who live so long that the world forgets them before they even die. And then there are those who, at the very end, forget the world first, not out of cruelty, but out of exhaustion. This is a story about one such man. A man who walked 100 years on this earth and took his final step somewhere no one was meant to walk alone. What he found there wasn't rescue. It wasn't warmth. It was something far quieter than that. His name was Elias. He was 94 years old when he disappeared into the glacier. Not because he was lost, not because he stumbled. He went there because some part of him, the oldest, most honest part, knew it was time and chose a place as ancient and indifferent as the years he had carried. The glacier didn't care how long he had lived. It didn't care about the wars he had survived, the children he had buried, the mornings he had watched rise and fall like breathing. It was just cold, silent, and waiting, the way cold things always wait. Elias had grown up in a small northern village where winter wasn't a season. It was a presence. Something that lived in the walls of your house, in the gaps between your fingers, in the space between words when two people sat across from each other and didn't know what to say. He learned early that silence and cold were not enemies. They were simply honest. They didn't pretend to be anything other than what they were. He respected that about them, even as a boy. He had been a carpenter for most of his life, not a famous one, not the kind whose work ends up in museums or histories. He made tables, chairs, window frames, coffins. He made things people needed without ever noticing they needed them, and he found a quiet dignity in that invisibility. His hands were extraordinary, wide, scarred, patient hands that understood wood the way some people understand language. He used to say that wood remembers every grain is a year, every knot is a wound the tree refused to let kill it. He loved that. He understood it. He had a wife named Marta. She was gentle in the way that certain kinds of light are gentle, not soft exactly, but never harsh. She laughed easily and cried without shame, and made the kind of coffee that made you believe mornings were worth showing up for. They had 3 children, 2 daughters and a son. The son died young, before he had a chance to become anything, and that grief settled into Elias like sediment in still water. It never left. It just became part of the floor he stood on. He learned to stand on it anyway, because Marta needed him to, and then later because the daughters needed him to, and then later still because there was simply no alternative. Marta died when Elias was 71. He had expected grief. He had not expected silence. The house, which had always felt full of small sounds, her footsteps, the particular way she closed cabinet doors, the music she hummed without realizing she was humming, went entirely quiet in a single afternoon. He sat in the kitchen for 3 days before his daughter came and found him. He had eaten nothing. He said he hadn't noticed. That was the truth. The years after Marta were different. Not empty exactly, but thinner somehow. He moved through time the way fog moves, present but without weight. He read, he walked, he visited his daughters and their families and held his grandchildren and felt something warm in his chest that he couldn't quite name. But at night when the house went dark and the cold came back in its old familiar way, he would sit by the window and watch the sky and feel something pressing on him. Not sadness entirely, more like the awareness of an absence so large it had its own gravity. He moved north when he was 86, not for any reason he could explain well to the people who asked. He told his daughters it was for the air. He told his oldest friend it was for the light. The truth was closer to something he didn't have words for, a feeling that he was following something, that somewhere ahead of him, in the cold and the distance, there was an answer to a question he had been asking his whole life without ever saying it aloud. The glacier was 3 hours from the nearest town. He had been there once before, decades ago, with Marta on a summer day, when it was still possible to walk along its edge and feel awed rather than afraid. He remembered the color of the ice, blue like nothing else on earth, not the blue of the sky or the sea, something older, something that made you feel your own smallness without cruelty, just as a fact, the way mathematics is a fact. He walked out onto the ice on a morning in February when the temperature had fallen to -50. The kind of cold that doesn't announce itself dramatically. It simply removes things. Warmth, sound, the sensation in your face, then your hands. He walked slowly. He was 94. He had his coat and his boots and the slow, deliberate pace of a man who has no reason to hurry. The ice stretched around him in every direction. The sky above was the pale gray of very early light, the sun not yet risen, the world suspended in that strange, almost dark, that feels like a held breath. He sat down after a while, not because he fell, because he chose to. He found a place where the ice was level and he sat down carefully, the way he had always sat down, deliberately, like a man who understood that the body is a borrowed thing and deserves a certain respect. He looked out across the glacier. The silence was profound, not peaceful exactly, deeper than peace. The kind of silence that existed before language, before memory, before the particular human habit of turning everything into meaning. He thought about the table he had made for Marta the year they married. Oak, wide enough for a family. He had carved her name into the underside where no one would see it, where only the floor and the table itself would ever know it was there. He thought about his son, who had died before he learned to walk without falling, and he wondered, as he had wondered 1,000 times, what that boy might have made of himself, what he might have built or broken or loved. He thought about the mornings, all the thousands of mornings that had come and gone like water. The cold moved through him without asking permission. That is the honest thing about cold at that level. It doesn't negotiate. It simply enters and rearranges you. He could no longer feel his feet, then his legs. He was not frightened. That surprised him, though perhaps it shouldn't have. He had been afraid of many things in 94 years. He had been afraid of failure, of loss, of the dark, of not being enough, of being forgotten. But here, sitting on ancient ice with the sky beginning its slow, pale brightening above him, the fear had simply gone. Not because everything was fine, but because nothing required it anymore. The last thing he felt clearly was the light. The sun rose somewhere behind the clouds, and everything went a soft, diffuse gold. The ice, the air, his own hands resting in his lap. He looked at those hands, old now, mapped with years. The same hands that had learned wood, that had held Marta, that had caught his daughters when they stumbled as small children, that had built things and fixed things and held things gently because holding gently was the only way he had ever known. He thought these hands were enough. He didn't know if that was true, but he thought it, and it steadied him. What he realized in those last clear minutes was not something he could have explained to anyone. It had no shape that language reaches easily. It was something like this, that a life is not a story with a meaning. It is just a life. It is just warmth and cold and love and loss and mornings and the way oak grain runs and the way a woman laughs without meaning to. It doesn't need to add up to something. It only needs to have been felt. He had felt it, all of it, even the parts that broke him, especially those. The glacier kept him in its silence. The blue ice that remembered centuries held him the way it held everything, without preference, without grief, without mercy or cruelty, just held him. And the world went on around him as it always had, as it always will, completely indifferent to the extraordinary, ordinary fact of one man's 100 years, which is perhaps the most honest ending any of us can ask for. Not meaning, just it happened. You were here. And for a while, briefly, gloriously, you were warm.